Just the DNA results came in and you are not the father.
Choose your group.
She tried. She just can't be a father. Yeah. Welcome back to what may be episode 52 or 53 of A People's Guide to Publishing. I am your host, Joe Beal, founder, CEO, autistic publisher of Microcosm, and author of A People's Guide to Publishing, the book, which I should have grabbed a copy since our last podcast.
My name's Ellie Blue. I am the marketing and editorial director of Microcosm, and I still am pretty into bikes.
Rumors of your demise have been greatly exaggerated?
That follows up on the cliffhanger on the end of the last episode.
If you didn't see that one, it's funny.
Go back.
Go back.
I'm Joe Green. I'm a bear in a top hat.
And I'm Mrs. Green.
Joe Green and Faith are both Microcosm authors. Mm-hmm. And today we are going to talk about when there is conflict between authors and publishers. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily conflict like we're having a fight, but more like most of the time when you have a good working relationship, your interests are aligned, but they're never always going to be aligned.
There needs to be some filling in of the gaps for the author to understand where the publisher is coming from, or more than that, vice versa.
Mm-hmm. So, Mrs. Green, otherwise known as Dr. Faith G. Harper, PhD, etc., we've been working together for the longest, since 2016, 2015?
Yeah.
BC.
5-ish years. Yeah.
We've been working together for 5 years. We've had some conflict. Mm-hmm. And we've survived it. Mm-hmm. It didn't even really feel like we were surviving conflict, but I guess, looking back, we've had plenty of disagreements.
I get a question a lot about, can you, help me break into writing or whatever, or can you look at this? And I'm like, I'm not an editor. I'm not a publisher. I don't run my own Kickstarters. My job is to put my ego in a corner with a box of crayons and let it color so the work can get done. And and that's kind of the process for all authors is our shit is not as precious as we think it is. And there you have a different viewpoint going into that than we have to have discussions about. I think actually the one that we're working on right now, and we're still kind of resolving it, was I didn't think it went as well into the 3-part model that we tend to use in all of our books. And it wasn't conflict. You're like, oh, I see it, but it also is not working the way you're trying to make it work. So we're trying to figure out a way to structure it. I don't think it's not that even we're in disagreement. We're just having to figure something out that works, and that's kind of the process. Yeah.
Or collaborating on the Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. Of what about this way? What about that way?
And I think the broadest perception that we get is that you send us a block of text, and we just make sure that all the commas are in the right place.
It's you open up your screen and then doves flat on the computer and it's beautiful. Versus oh God, here's another fucking shit show from Faith.
The biggest back and forth I remember us having was early in our work together. You used to open all your zines by being let's take this word anxiety or grief or depression or whatever and find the dictionary definition and start by engaging with that. And so I'm also a big word nerd, and so I would delve really deeply, and I think we had a really protracted email argument over the suffix ER and what it meant.
And it wasn't even an argument. We were both just kind of are we doing this right? And I think we just said, fuck it, let's not worry about it and cut it. Yeah.
And then the solution that I came up with, and I don't know if we agreed on it or not, but I kind of imposed it, was we're not going to do the word definitions anymore. Which, and honestly, one of the reasons that we argued about it for so long was because it really was the first 2 pages of a 16-page zine depended on it, and it did require a lot of work to take that out and re-edit it. So I was more motivated to find a way to make it work than if it had been easy to take out and we could have just been let's cut it and move on. But also we did go back and forth a lot about that, and I appreciate that because there are definitely authors who you're oh hey, let's change this thing, or can you rewrite this so that makes more sense? And they'll be no, I did not expect to be edited.
Yeah. I probably, with your comments, 80 to 90% of them, oh yeah, total sense, I'm cool with that, and I have to say, Ellie too will say, if we do this, are we changing inherent meaning? You always defer to me, clinically, did I do this wrong if I'm making this edit? So it's never a matter of you trying to, override, all the letters after my name and that part of it. It's about how it's presented and the order it's presented in, and it's clear. And a lot of times it's stuff hey, I need you to explain what a neuron actually is. And I'm oh, Right. Like, of coming from writing academically and still sometimes having to remember to bring that down.
Yeah, and there's been plenty of times that I've been wrong too. Like when I've been like, we should take out this section, it doesn't fit with the book. And you've been like, no, that is the most important thing. I will die on this hill. And then, and then we like make it like we figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, the real problem isn't that it's there. The real problem is that this is written in this dense academic language with lots of technical terms. So please rewrite it in lay speak, and then it works.
Yeah. Or even things like we were just talking about this the other day. Is I have a tendency to storytell because that works clinically. Like so, if I'm having a conversation, because a lot of times I go into how would I explain this to like a client in front of me. It tends to be my starting point. And I do story tell with clients of like, hey, this is how Mr. Green and I deal with this conflict issue. And you're like, I don't give a shit about y'all's conversations about sushi for dinner. And so a lot of times and you're very nice about it. You're like, but yeah, all this has to go. Or the fact that I sweated through my dress when I was defending my dissertation or whatever. And that's fine. I'm not like, I'm just like, that's my starting point for, processing and, telling the story. And I'm not losing anything by editing it out. So it's usually small things like that I'm not bothered by.
Well, thank you for being so willing to. So, Mr. Green, you and Joe Beal work together editorially. Can you have an argument in front of us for entertainment right now?
No, we cannot.
No. It's pretty easy, to be honest. I was a film critic for a long time for a magazine in San Antonio, and I wrote a bad review of a terrible film that had local financing.
Oh, no.
It's what we call the learning curve. I guess the head of the investment group of San Antonio wrote a letter to the magazine complaining. Anyway, I found that I was no longer given films to review. I was interviewing Bobby Seale, and that same magazine, many years later, agreed to run the interview. And then I turned it in, and then they suddenly was like, blah, 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 and then finally came down to the editorialist told us not to run this interview. Bobby Seale is the co-founder of the Black Panthers. So compared to that, Joe's really easy.
Yeah. You need to tell us why this sentence is here. You need to tell us who this person is.
Exactly.
Because you can't assume a level of familiarity in your readership.
Yeah, same with, you need to go back and explain what a neuron is.
It's the same exact thing, and it's very helpful because, I know who all these people are, and sometimes I forget that the reader doesn't necessarily know everybody who was involved in
or
Watergate.
the wife. We have to have a conversation of like, and I would know this how.
And I would know this how is the ultimate trick of an editor.
Yep.
Of which I would very much hesitate to call myself an editor.
You are currently on our editorial team.
Despite my utter lack of English education throughout any point in my life. All points in my life?
Yeah.
So we've talked about editorial conflict. Often also authors and publishers have contractual conflict.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a good one because I feel like we have money wrapped up in this other thing. We don't want to piss off the wrong people.
Yeah.
It's sort of the biggest thing that you avoid when you're working in independent publishing. But you do have, I guess, the ego problem seems to be a big one. Mm-hmm. And the problem of, like, I thought it would be this other way and I never expressed it prior is sort of the other big one.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the big thing is there's been plenty of times where I've asked you questions and you can... My thing is I'm trying to understand this better. I'm never presuming that I'm going to be fucked over, but I'm more like trying to understand, like, hey, what does this mean or where does this come from? And you always answer that, and that's like the end of the fucking conversation. So, like, it's not that, your company doesn't want to have you ask questions if you're trying to understand your royalty statements or whatever, but I think you probably have a lot of people who presume that you're fucking them over and they kind of go in combative. And that's just kind of not a good way to live life in general. Like, presume that people are doing their best. Everybody will probably be happier. So I've never had y'all not want to answer a question.
99% of the communications we get about royalty statements are not assuming that we are cheating anybody, but just them saying, but I don't understand.
What does this mean again? And you're like, oh, yeah, that was XYZ. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool.
And it's often because they forgot about something or, we had a big sale and we didn't tell them about it, so it's the funniest part where, like, an author's ego can work both ways because they can assume that there's a discrepancy in their statement where we have, like, a giant sales spike in September and they're like, clearly you did not actually sell 20 times what you normally do that month. Like, this must be a typo.
They think it's an error in their favor. And that's really
we have too much ego for that. We've never thought that.
Like, maybe we'll get authors that we've worked with for 10, 20 years and just come back and say, I hate to admit it now, but I've never understood these reports, and can you help me? And sometimes we can get them there, and other times they just aren't math people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say, like, if there's conflict that, like, feels like conflict, where, like, working out a problem together where you maybe both have different needs, but where, like, there's actually argument and fight and contention, like, I would say, like, if you and an author have conflict, or if you and your publisher have conflict about one thing, you'll probably have conflicts about more things. It seems to be specific to that relationship rather than specific to that type of interaction. So, if you have early conflicts with somebody, you can know maybe not to continue working with them.
Right, yeah.
And I think if it's stuff like money too, and money's not your thing, having, getting an accountant or something to help you with that process, because, how authors are paid and what that does to your taxes and stuff is weird and complicated.
Where authors will assume that they wrote a book, thus they should be able to quit their job, thus they should be able to, like, earn a certain amount of, middle-class living from writing one book. Like, we do run into that. That is not as common, but it does happen. And so they often assume that, like, having an agency or an accountant or a lawyer will function as their advocate, when in reality those things are more just like it's just somebody else to explain to them how it works.
Right.
Exactly.
And it doesn't actually get you a leg up in any way, because it's like we are I guess we're completely unique in that we don't play poker. We're just like, this is what we can afford. This is the offer on the table. Like, you will get. This is what you will get.
It is what it is. Yeah.
And, like, so there isn't room for negotiation here because we don't have outside financing.
Unless you're John Grisham or J.K. Rowling, like, you're not going to live off your books. I make more money than a lot of authors do, but I don't live off that. And I also, like, even if I got to the point where I could, and maybe could at this point, I don't presume that it's always going to be like that. I live off my practice, and that money is things going into, like, we donate a lot of money to causes that are important to us. Y'all did buy me a car this year. Thank you. I did need a new car.
A lot of conflict seems to come from expectations.
For sure.
And so, like, if you communicate as much as possible up front about expectations, and we actually recently had a sort of conflicted relationship with an author we had, like, several questions come up, and then someone who was really angry, and as a result we really beefed up our documentation, and we created a Google Drive that we now share with every author that we sign a contract with, and with everyone that we're currently working with. And it has, like, frequently asked questions. It has, like, a whole fact sheet about how to understand your royalty statement. It outlines the process. It has a checklist of exactly what we're looking for at every editorial stage. And so it's a little too soon to say, but we're already starting to see, actually, authors are reading it and then, like, turning in different kinds of drafts and asking different kinds of questions. And it's like, a certain percentage of people will read it really carefully, and a certain percentage of people will skim it once and then forget, and some people will never read it and still be angry about whatever they were going to be mad about and expect. But
at least you have paperwork back.
Yeah, exactly.
At least we tried.
Yeah, and we're starting to have our, like, HR person onboard all of our new authors and talk about expectations and kind of, like, put a friendly face on it.
Presuming that everyone's doing the best they can, and not presuming that people are trying to fuck you over. It's just a better way to go through life. I'd rather take a hit every once in a while than just be guarded and think that everyone's a dick.
That's kind of how I think of it too, where it's like, if somebody is distrustful to that degree, there's either, like, a prior experience that led to that, or that's, like, sort of how they go through life.
And if somebody does fuck you over, then all right, well, we're done with them. I would rather, take a hit every once in a while and, presume good of people. It's just better for my mental health.
Yeah, that too.
And the number one problem we see with publishers is they print way too many copies of a book. But the number two problem we see is they keep their authors in a black box of information and do not explain to them what they're doing, why they're doing it, how things operate. So the author is just blindsided and confused and feels like it has to be an antagonistic relationship. And obviously it's better for everybody if it's not.
In fact, if anything, you probably over-explain. You're always telling me more stuff that I'm like, okay.
Right, right.
Yeah, you tend to be so clear about everything that's going on. So if somebody's really interested in the nitty-gritty, it's all there.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub.
On Twitter at Microcosm.
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at microcosm_pub.
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.